name is Kyle Bussey. I am Vice Chair of the City of Portland Human Rights Commission, and I'm Chair of the Commission's newly created Human Trafficking Task Force. The first thing I'd like to do is thank the Human Rights Commission for hosting this evening tonight. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Human Rights Commission, we're a volunteer-based commission that was re-established by the City of Portland in 2008. Our mission is to work to eliminate discrimination and bigotry, to strengthen intergroup relationships, and to foster greater understanding, inclusion, and justice for those who live, work, study, worship, and play in the City of Portland. In doing so, we are guided by the principles embodied in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Your Human Rights Commissioners, because I think it's important that you know who they are sitting up front here. They are Alan Lazo, the chair, Danita Fry, Hector Lopez, Abdul Majidi, Emily Gottfried, Malloy Good, where's Amy Croscobb, Myra Ariola, Diallo Bennett, and one of our distinguished panelists, Stephen Manning. And where is Damon? Damon's in the back, not in his seat. Damon Turner, who is also an active member of the Human Trafficking Task Force, and along with myself and Stephen, if you have any questions after the forum about the Human Trafficking Task Force, the direction that we're going, the projects that we're working on or will be working on, please feel free to talk to any of us about that. We'd be happy to do that. I would also like to acknowledge Sarah Hussein from Commissioner Fritz's office. She's in the back by the door here, trying to avoid being noticed. She's put in countless hours on this project, and we wouldn't be here without her, so thank you very much, Sarah. So we're here tonight to discuss human trafficking, which has been referred to both as modern-day slavery and also as one of the fastest-growing criminal enterprises in the world. We're incredibly lucky to have a panel of experts who are going to share their wealth of knowledge and experience with us with regard to this practice, which unfortunately is very common in this community. Our panelists include Stephen Manning, who I just mentioned. Stephen's a partner with the Immigrant Law Group, which among other things works with trafficking victims. Stephen also coordinates nationwide litigation strategies to advance the rights of immigrants through his work with the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Stephen is, as I said, also a City of Portland Human Rights Commissioner. We also have Chris Kilmer, who is the Program Coordinator for Catholic Charities Outreach and Support to Special Immigrant Populations Human Trafficking Program. You might have seen that program referred to as OSSIP, O-S-S-I-P. Chris is also a founding member of Oregonians Against Trafficking Humans, which is a coalition of parties interested in or affected by human trafficking. Anna Shashelsky, on the far end, is a senior staff attorney with Immigration Counseling Service, which is dedicated to improving the lives of Oregon's immigrant communities. Anna also serves on the Oregon Foreign-Born Victims Assistance Task Force, which addresses human trafficking of immigrant victims. Diane Short-Sykes is a senior assistant attorney general who leads the Civil Rights Unit for the Oregon Department of Justice. Before joining the Justice Department, Diane specialized in the representation of immigrant populations in civil rights matters with the Oregon Law Center. And finally, Keith Bickford is a detective with the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office. He's been a detective with the Sheriff's Office for 17 years, and he is currently the director of the Oregon Human Trafficking Task Force and both the Oregonians Against Trafficking Humans. Thank you all very much for being here tonight. As you might surmise from the credentials of our panel, this forum will be focused on one particular aspect of human trafficking, which is foreign-born trafficking. I believe Stephen is going to address this, but I wanted to clarify for those who may be concerned that we're not giving due attention to domestic human trafficking, particularly domestic sex trafficking. The Human Rights Commission's task force is not limiting itself just to foreign-born trafficking. This hearing is limited to foreign-born trafficking, which is where we're focused tonight. You might have noticed a sign-in sheet on your way in. If you're interested in being involved with our efforts regarding all forms of human trafficking or participating in future events dedicated to trafficking issues, please feel free to sign up for the listserv out there. You can also make contact with us through the Human Rights Commission's email address, which is hrc@portlandoregon.gov, and I or other members of the Human Trafficking Task Force would be happy to speak to you after the forum or at any time about how we can work together to make our efforts to end trafficking more effective. For tonight, each of our panelists will have the opportunity to provide us with their perspectives on trafficking in this community, their view on what is being done to combat this industry, what obstacles exist that are making the fight more difficult, and what we could be doing to make our efforts to eradicate this practice more effective. We have a lot to get through, but I do want to give you a chance to ask some questions, so this is more of a forum format. So depending on the time, we will try to get questions in between each of the panelists' individual presentations. And the panelists will be able to provide their insights with regard to those questions. Time permitting, we would also like to provide time for public comment. And there is a sign-in sheet for public comment out on the table outside where the listserv sign-in sheet is. And so if you want to put your name on that, that would help us to organize public comment at the end. If you do have the opportunity to give public comment, please remember that we do have a little bit of a time-sensitive evening here tonight, so I try to keep it to a couple of minutes, and also understand that public comment is an information gathering process, and so we don't actually respond to public comment. It goes in the record of the forum, and the Human Rights Commission will use that for informational purposes later. With that, I will turn it over to the experts, starting with the HRC's resident expert, Stephen Manning. Stephen.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you everyone for coming this evening. Being here tonight as part of this hearing is very, very important because it's going to allow the HRC, as we move forward in understanding and addressing concerns involving human trafficking, your presence, understanding what's going on here from the panelists as they explain and describe to us the issues that are affecting our community in regards to victims of human trafficking. And it doesn't matter whether it's an adult who's been trafficked in for the sex industry, whether it's a victim of labor trafficking here in the United States, or whether it's a child who's been trafficked in for sex purposes into the sex industry as well. Tonight's discussion is about trafficking. Right? It's about how human beings exploit other human beings in a way that is just immoral, not good. So tonight we're asking the panelists if they would address and discuss and provide testimony about transnational trafficking of human beings. After our prior community forums on trafficking the HRC held, the HRC was approached by community members indicating that there may be some gaps. There may be some gaps in our local response to ending trafficking here locally. And that those gaps may not be being addressed. And that is one of the reasons why we have taken up this inquiry. We're also aware of our work, the HRC's work through the Community and Police Relations Committee, that victims of transnational human trafficking are going to reside in new immigrant populations. And historically, new immigrant populations and the police, the relationship between law enforcement and new immigrant populations has been marked by distrust. And finally, the discussion tonight on transnational human trafficking is going to provide a starting point for the HRC, as Kyle described, to move deeper into the issue, and not to address human trafficking in all of its forms. The HRC, in its role as a body between the community and the law enforcement, between the community and government, is wanting to marshal these resources and marshal this expertise on this panel to be able to address and find those gaps and be able to fill them or fix them. There are 3 things that we're hoping the panelists can help speak to. The first is they could talk a little bit about the legal regime, about trafficking. Talk a little bit about the international aspects, the federal response, and our local response, the local response here in Oregon. What are we doing? What does it mean? What does it mean to be trafficked? What is the difference between being trafficked, human trafficking, and migrant smuggling? So alien smuggling. So what is the difference, and how do we address that difference? And what is the training necessary for individuals who are involved in providing response to know that difference? This is one definition of human trafficking that's from the United Nations protocol on the prevention of human trafficking. And perhaps the panelists could address this definition or other definitions that may appear in either federal or state law. We're interested in hearing about the assessment and identification right now between how the local, so the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, and the government work together and collaborate, how that process works, what are the services that are presently provided, and where in your honest objective assessment, where are these gaps? What do you see in practice? What do you see happening in the field? And what role could the HRC take in helping address those issues? Finally, we're hoping that you could also address what are these local the local resources and the law enforcement effort. Because the HRC can be a bridge between communities and our quasi-governmental role, quasi-governmental function. We're able to reach out into communities in ways that other organizations may not be able to. We're also able to bring governmental partners to the table in ways that other organizations might not be able to. So what is it that the HRC can do to support our local resources and law enforcement? So there's going to be several witnesses talking tonight who are going to present and share this information. So you didn't come to hear me talk, you came to hear them talk, so let's let them talk. Mr. Beck.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight, and I really appreciate being able to sit up and talk for a little bit about the trafficking. As Kyle mentioned, I direct the Oregon Human Trafficking Task Force. I've been doing this for about 4.5 years now. I was, for the last 2 weeks, knowing that I was going to come up here and talk about this, I was stressing over it quite a bit. And of course, very nervous. I'm not a public speaker, but I realized that the biggest part of this was, or what I was nervous about, was not talking in front of people, but getting my point across and not looking like an idiot doing it. The task force is very difficult to define, so I'll do my best and kind of and if there's questions later, of course, I'll take whatever questions are out there. I had to break the task force down into 2 different groups. There's a domestic task force that deals with the underage children in the United States involved in sexual exploitation. That task force now is up and running and doing pretty well. The FBI has taken over kind of the law enforcement side of it, called the Innocence Loss Task Force. And along with that, there's a victim assistance task force that helps with the victims, from juvenile mental health, anything to do with the juvenile program. These people are involved in helping out. That has, like I said, it's taken legs and has done pretty well. It's made it up to Senator Wyden's office as far as the political side goes. There's legislation out there. There's a big push to get some of these laws to have a little bit more bite to them. So I was able to kind of set that aside and start working then on the international or foreign-born side of trafficking. When I talk to people, it started to concern me a little bit because of Chris and I are involved with the Oregonians Against Trafficking Humans. And when we were going out and talking and people wanting us to come out and talk, a lot of the discussion was, we want to learn about the domestic side of trafficking because that's the only trafficking there is. And that was very concerning, and I felt that I was not doing my job properly, that I wasn't giving human trafficking the full attention that it needed. So like I said, I could set the domestic aside and start working on international. Not an easy task. I have to work a lot more with my federal partners, my federal law enforcement partners, and most of you know how talkative and sharing they are. Okay, so it's a very difficult groups to deal with. And not only are they not very helpful and talkative to me, but they don't even talk amongst each other and help and communicate. So I had to, for me it was obvious, for everybody in this room it's obvious that communication communication is a very important part of law enforcement and getting the word out and combating trafficking. So I worked very hard on that, and I did trip and fall several times, I'll be honest with that. It was difficult, but I think we now have a direction from the U.S. Attorney's Office on down through ICE, which I don't want to assume everybody knows what I'm talking about, so ICE is the Immigration Customs Enforcement. That's broken down into HSI, which is the Department of Homeland Security Investigations, and then ERO, which is the Enforcement Removal Operations. They were people that were in their offices and we never talked, we never saw them. They are now coming out and talking to the community. They've realized that you can't just sit around and make decisions and do the things that they're doing without ramifications later. They're realizing that, they're coming out and talking, and I will hopefully continue to get them to come out and talk and address problems, and not just through emails or through little pieces of paper they send out, but actually come out in person and talk about it. That's important, to make connections with people. That's where we're going to get things moving. I've been very lucky because of my foreign-born task force with the victim assistance. A great group of people. I have Chris Kilmer, Anna sitting next to me over here. There's a whole bunch of immigration attorneys out there that have taught me so much and have been just the most wonderful people when helping out undocumented immigrants and helping me understand how immigration law works, how devastating the trafficking can be on these people. I did write up a whole bunch of stuff that I was going to talk about, and then I'm throwing it all away because it's just too many words. I think it's important, like I said, to make the connections, to open up the communication. Law enforcement, like I said before, very difficult to deal with. A lot of law enforcement agencies don't recognize that they need training or they need help. That they do have a problem. So you're working with a lot of Type A personalities, and that's hard to get your point across a lot of times. I'm slowly chipping away. Counties that I've talked to throughout the state of Oregon, before when I talked to them about, foreign-born trafficking and labor trafficking, things like that, they flat out told me, even some of the sheriffs in different counties told me, we don't have a problem like that. It's not here. I still sent them a big old packet of information and kept pushing the best I could, talking to other people. And finally, they're calling me now and asking for more information and what can we do to help combat this. I didn't realize it was out there. And the explanation was pretty simple. When you start talking about the victims, you're talking about a perfect victim, at least the way I look at it. These are people that are scared to death of everything. And then we're talking about undocumented immigrants. I always like to say, for a lot of people that are trying to grasp this, picking you up and shoving you somewhere like in Russia, or somewhere where you don't speak the language, you don't understand the culture, you don't know about their laws, you don't know much about anything. And try to imagine surviving in that. and the first person you run into happens to speak English, have a big smile on their face and saying, you know what, I can help you. I can take you out of this situation and make things better. You don't have any documentation, you're not there lawfully. You're going to kind of think, you know what, I found a nice friendly face, I'm going to go and get some help. And that's what these people are doing. I can tell you from all the people that I've interviewed from all over the world, every one of them has told me, I've seen the big smile on the faces, I've heard the promises, and everything came crashing down when I got here. None of that was true, and yet they still came out to talk to us. They still came out for an interview to talk to law enforcement, which to me is, I can't even tell you in words how courageous that is. That's a very scary thing to do when the stories that go through talking about immigration and how people just disappear. I mean, the stories are phenomenal, what these people are telling each other and talking about and communicating. I feel honored that they come out and talk and tell me their stories. And the sad part about it is that, you know, they're very trusting people, and they're trafficked by their fellow countrymen. They're trafficked by their family members, by friends, by diplomats, by consulates. They're coming. A lot of them come from countries that have corrupt law enforcement and government, and you know, trust is just not in their vocabulary. They don't have that. That's a very damaged part of their thinking. So, what I'm working on with my task force. My victim assistance side's they've already got it. I mean, they're down with everything and they know how to handle all this very well. And they're teaching me, and then I'm transferring that to my law enforcement. That we can't just show up with a big cape on and a big S on our chest and say, we're here to help you, come and talk to us, you'll be safe. It's just not going to happen. You know, we have to soften up, we have to talk, we have to understand that there are so many communities out, just in Multnomah County itself, there's so many communities out there that are scared to death of everything. I mean, so many people I've talked to have even mentioned that going to a hospital is scary, because in their country they go to a hospital to die. They don't go to get better. You know, just that by itself really put it in perspective of how scared these people are. So my goal with the task force is to start the outreach, to start communicating better and finding in different ethnic communities, different leaders. And I don't want to go necessarily to the political side of leadership. I want to go to the people that have their hands in the dirt all the time, the ones that are working at the resource centers, the churches, the places these people go to know that they're going to be safe and feel safe, and that they won't be judged or because of their status or whatever, that they know they can go there. And that's where we need to go and start talking and opening up communication. And I don't expect people to trust me the first time they see me. I really don't. There's no ego here, believe me. I don't have it. I understand. I have to prove that I'm out here to help. And standing back and allowing victim assistance to come out and help too, great. I'm all about teamwork. That's all there is to it for me. I'm not going to be a one-man show, and there's no way I could ever do that. So that's kind of where I'm taking the task force right now. And I'm not the most popular person in the task force because of that. You know, a lot of people don't like the idea of going out and talking and learning about what the real problems are out there, but they're starting to understand and realize that that's the only way that we're going to get undocumented immigrants to come and talk. And then once we get them to talk and we take care of them in every way possible, comprehensive services for them, we take care of them that way, then we can start cutting the head off the snake. We can start going after the traffickers and start making a difference. But until then, you know, we have to take care of these victims because they're just not going to want to talk to us. So that's kind of the goal of the Trafficking Task Force. I've talked way too much. I apologize. If you have any questions or comments, were we going to open that up now? Kyle, where'd you go? Oh, there you are. Did you want to open that or just wait for Q&A afterwards? Or?
Yeah, does anybody have any questions for Keith or in response to what Keith has just discussed, that either Keith or anybody else on the panel could address?
I guess I would just like to know how much advance notice do you need in order to come out and share with the organizations that we're connected to?
I'm sorry, I missed half of that. Could you repeat again,
How
please?
much time do you need in order to have you come out and do some sort of program or sharing with the organizations, the community organizations that we're connected with?
I'm ready when you are. I will throw together whatever I can. We have some great classes that Chris and I have put together to step out and talk about just human rights, labor trafficking, explanations like that. Just real basic things to educate people so they know and understand that we're here to help and that they have rights and that we respect that. So I have business cards if you want to grab one and we can talk, and we're ready when you are, absolutely.
And just so everybody knows, the question was how long does Keith need, as far as advance notice goes, to come out and do these outreach efforts when a community organization or a group of people would like to have Keith come out and help them with that problem?
I have a question, Keith.
Yes, sir.
First, thank you so much. I always know how dedicated you are and honest and forward person you are.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate that. And please don't apologize about your long. I would love to hear a lot more, actually, from you. But my question, I know domestic trafficking have a good lobbying system. They have a lot of funding coming from politicians and some leaders. How about the other side? What's the support from politicians and leaders from our communities in Oregon?
That hasn't been a very, do you want to mention this?
repeat the question?
His question.
Okay, the question was, how much support am I getting on the foreign-born side of trafficking? From politicians to money, grants, things like that. And my personal opinion is it's ridiculous because I don't have a lot of support. We have Catholic Charities out there that has a comprehensive program to help trafficking victims, and they have to live off a grant, and they have to reapply for a grant. They have to continue on just grant money. That, to me, in my mind, that's ridiculous. This place should be up and going and always going and never shut down. There should never be, downtime for a place like that. So, like I said, it's not very popular. I have to be very careful when I'm talking to people, especially if I want to bring it up into to the level that it's at with like Senator Wyden, for example. It's not a very popular subject when you're talking about undocumented immigrants. And you're going to have one side of a room screaming and yelling and agreeing with something, and the other side of the room screaming and yelling and disagreeing. That people don't have rights if they don't belong here, and all that stuff. Believe me, I've heard all of it. And it's easy to shut them up now because I'm getting older and crankier, so I can just pretty much tell them to shut up. But the bottom line is, I think if I can get more information out and I can make people realize that folks aren't just coming in over the border lines here, and just running over and getting a job and everything's happy. They're victims. People are taking advantage of them, like I said, through visa programs, even visa programs. People are coming over legally, and then their visa gets revoked. And then they're stuck here, and the trafficker knows that and takes total advantage of them. So, and your own diplomats, and I mean, it's amazing how big this is. So the folks I've talked to have come over, would like a better life, but there's so many other factors behind there that I just have to chip away and be very patient when I'm talking and explain everything a lot more before I can get that support. I know it's there. It's just a matter, like I said, of just getting the word out.
Thank you.
I think right here we have a question.
I'm just wondering if you can give us a sense of scale, like how prevalent this is, what kind of numbers we're talking about, what are typical forms that it takes. I don't know, somebody else on the panel was planning to cover that as well, but just something to suggest how big a problem is it and what forms does it take?
And that's a great question. And as far as actual numbers, I don't have any because we don't have a lot of folks coming out and talking about it just yet and making reports. What I do know, for example, in just the state of Oregon, there are a little over 300 registered labor camps just in the state of Oregon. I was told by OSHA, who follows this very closely, that you can multiply that by 3, and that's how many unregistered labor camps there are in Oregon. Now, I guarantee you that the registered labor camps probably have some issues that we need to work on, but the unregistered labor camps, God only knows what's going on out there. And that is very concerning to me. If I remember right, a registered labor camp is 5 or more people living within this camp. An unregistered, of course, is less than 5. But the amount of males, females, children involved in all that, I just don't have those numbers yet. I know that the people I have interviewed have said all the way down as far down as South America have said, you know what, I was coming to the United States and my target state was Oregon. Some of them have even mentioned like Woodburn, Portland, Salem. I mean, they've told me flat out that, you know, they were going to make the trip up and Oregon was the place to go. So that's a big deal, and to me that tells me that there's a lot of folks out there that we need to make an effort to try to find and communicate with.
We have time for one more question for Keith and Jerry.
Jerry.
Hand up first, I think.
It's actually kind of two. The gentleman referred to the great programs we have with domestic trafficking, which I would say that's not true. Can you tell us how much is available currently, how many services are available currently for domestic trafficking?
For domestic?
Right, he was saying, you know, domestic trafficking you have a lot of services for already, which we don't. What I really want to know is, are you also working with, I work with the Diversity Civic Leadership Programs, a lot of folks from the Immigrant Refugee Community Organization.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime when we're doing advocacy, what we're talking to folks about on advocating around human trafficking is that we hear a lot of stories about nail salons and mail order brides.
Mm-hmm.
Are you working on those issues?
Absolutely. Yeah, nail salons, massage parlors, you know, you don't want to say that every massage parlor or nail salon is bad news, but you definitely, it's something to look into. And the mail order bride, absolutely. You know, there are 2 different forms of that I've noticed. There's the actual mail order bride part, but then there's also other countries where we've had a lot of females come up that were just pretty much kidnapped at a very young age, married down in their country and then brought here to the United States and trafficked and sexually assaulted and all sorts of horrid stories. So yes, that's also a big concentration as well, yes.
Okay, and just for the benefit of the Human Rights Commission in our work going forward, one of the things that you talked about was trying to make it a long-term goal to engage in outreach with these at-risk immigrant communities. And going forward with our Human Trafficking Task Force, it would probably be really helpful to us to know your opinion about what obstacles there are, in your opinion, about obstacles that present themselves to you when you're trying to get out into those at-risk communities, and how you think that we as a city might be able to do something about that, because as the HTTF goes forward, we're going to be wanting to address those issues. So.
For me, the biggest obstacle, and I kind of said a little bit about it earlier, was just the fact that you're dealing with a very vulnerable, scared population. And they don't want to come out of the darkness. They don't want to come out of hiding because it's very scary. And Chris and I sat down and talked about this quite a bit, and I think Chris will probably talk a little bit more about it. But we have been doing a grassroots outreach to a lot of the Latino population. I've been very lucky to have a woman over in Washington County who's willing to come out and teach human rights, labor trafficking class in Spanish. And we go to ESL classes. When I'm driving around, for example, anywhere, but especially the city of Portland, I'll look at like different church signs and things like that, and if they have an ESL class and a phone number to call, I'll call that and talk to them and see what community they're reaching out to and who they're trying to help, you know, and trying to expand my horizons a little bit too, so I can understand how better to help this population. So I think for me and for the commissioners, it's a grassroots approach. You know, going to the places that serve these communities every single day, clinics, things like that. I think that's going to be the big help in helping them understand that they have rights and that there are people out there to help them. And you know, just trying to take it as slowly and patiently as possible, and you know, let them get used to, you know, it's the young lady that helps me, Teresa, a very sweet young lady. She's about 5 foot tall. So I look like an ogre standing next to her in these classes, you know. So I have to be very careful and not, you know, get too pushy or whatever. I kind of just sit back and let people take it in a little bit, and then, you know, there's a little more acceptance. She engages me in the conversation a little bit, and then before we know it, you know, we're laughing and talking. They're coming up and talking and saying thank you and things like that. So, you know, I can't be that big flash, you know, hey, I'm here to help. Don't be afraid of me, as they're running out the door, and you know, and I'll never see him again. So, you know, it's very careful that way.
Thank you. Stephen is now going to introduce us to a former client of his, or a current client.
So by means of making this introduction, I'd like to actually describe just a little bit about how this case came to be and our work in collaboration with Keith. And I want to do that by first describing the difference between human trafficking and migrant smuggling. So, migrant smuggling, there's 4 principal distinctions. Migrant smuggling versus human trafficking. So one of the first distinctions is consent. In migrant smuggling, there's generally consent sometime in the process, where in human trafficking, an individual who is a victim of human trafficking has never consented. Or if consent was first given at the beginning, that consent has now been rendered inoperable by coercion or deceptive practices. The second big difference is between trafficking and migrant smuggling is exploitation. That the migrant smuggling ends when the migrant arrives in their destination, where with human trafficking, the exploitation continues. The third is transnationality. Migrant smuggling always involves crossing, is always transnational in nature, whereas trafficking is not. There's domestic trafficking. And the final difference is the source of profits. With migrant smuggling, the source of profits that the smuggler receives is in this act of transportation, the act of smuggling. Where in trafficking, it's in the act of trafficking, where the individual is coming into the United States for their particular industry or purpose. And that's where their profits come from. The distinctions between migrant smuggling and human trafficking can be very subtle. And they require a lot of training and a lot of deep analysis of the situation. In the case that I'm going to present Valentino Ramirez, he's going to explain a little bit about his history to you. And when he does so, he was a victim of human trafficking. He was trafficked into the United States for his labor. And working with Keith, Keith was able to see the distinction, the subtle distinction between migrant smuggling and labor trafficking. And so I'll let Valentino share his story.
Hola, gracias por venir y por su atención de ustedes.
Thank you for coming here and for your attention.
Yo soy ministro y he ido a algunas iglesias y he visto más gente, pero ahora me tiemblan las piernas cuando veo a ustedes.
I'm a minister and I've been to a lot of churches and spoken before more people, but right now my legs are trembling in front of you.
Porque voy a hablar de mi vida y es algo que cuando hablas de tu vida siempre te recuerda el pasado y siempre cuesta trabajo de hablarlas.
Because I'm going to speak about my life, and when you remember your history, it's sometimes very difficult.
Okay, Mi nombre es Valentino Ramírez López. Gracias por darme la oportunidad de compartir mi historia.
My name is Valentino Ramirez Lopez. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my story.
Con las comisiones de hoy, soy una víctima de la trata de personas,
With the commission today, I'm a victim of human trafficking.
que yo estaba recién en México. Nuestra familia era muy pobre.
When I was growing up in Mexico, my family was very poor.
Me llevaron lejos de mi familia cuando yo tenía 10 años de edad. Me llevaron lejos de mi familia cuando yo tenía 10 años de edad.
I was taken from my family when I was 10 years old.
Yo estaba hecho para trabajar en México donde me obligaron a recoger fresas, frutas, verduras.
I was made to work in Mexico picking strawberries, fruits, and vegetables.
He trabajado 7 días a la semana durante todo el día.
I worked 7 days a week all day.
Si no funcionaba lo suficientemente rápido o lo suficientemente duro, me golpeaban.
If I didn't work hard enough or fast enough, I was beaten.
Esto continuó por 4 a 5 años entonces.
This went on for about 4 or 5 years.
Me dijeron que me estaban llevando a los Estados Unidos.
They told me that they were going to take me to the United States.
Pensé tal vez las cosas serían mejor para mí.
I thought that things would perhaps be better for me.
Para mí los Estados Unidos era un lugar bonito, lleno de edificios altos y buena gente.
For me, the United States was a beautiful place full of tall buildings and good people.
Yo podría ir a la escuela o el trabajo para mí mismo,
I could go to school or work for myself,
pero eso no es lo que me pasó a mí.
but this is not what happened to me.
Recuerdo cuando llegamos a la casa segura, pensé, ¿este es Estados Unidos?
I remember that when I arrived to the safe house, I thought, this is America?
Yo estaba muy confundido porque me pareció igual que antes.
I remember I was very confused because it seemed just like it was before.
Yo era un prisionero.
I was a prisoner.
Yo no lo sabía entonces, pero yo estaba en Oregón.
I didn't know it then, but I was in Oregon.
Al igual que antes, tuve que trabajar 7 días a la semana, desde la mañana hasta la tarde en el día.
Just like before, I had to work 7 days a week from the morning until night.
El trabajo era muy duro.
Work was very difficult.
Después de trabajar, tenía que cocinar para la guardia.
After work, I had to cook for my guardian.
Yo vivía en un remolque,
I lived in a trailer
en un campo lejos de todo y no se permitía salir,
in a field very far away from everything, and I was not allowed to leave,
salvo solamente a trabajar,
only to go to work,
y luego que siempre estaría acompañado por los guardianes.
and I was always accompanied by guardians.
Yo no sabía español o inglés, solo mi lenguaje materna indígena trique.
I didn't know Spanish or English, only my native language of Trique.
Así que no podía comunicarme tanto con los demás trabajadores.
And so I couldn't communicate much with even the other workers.
Mi guardia que tenía conmigo mismo, mi guardia de aquí no me iba a comprar ropa.
The guardian that was with me would not go buy me clothes.
Yo no tenía zapato,
I didn't have shoes.
yo no tenía jabón,
I didn't have soap.
yo no he tenido a mí mismo limpiar regularmente.
I couldn't clean myself regularly.
Algunos días había comido y yo no llegué a comer.
Some days there wasn't food and I wasn't able to eat.
Si no trabajaba lo suficiente me golpeaban y yo tenía mucho miedo, yo estaba muy triste.
If I didn't work hard, I was beaten. I was very afraid. I was very sad.
Sucedió que yo entonces conocí a un pastor cuando llegó a la granja donde trabajaba. en un día para dar los servicios religiosos.
One day it happened that I met a pastor when he came to the farm where I was working to give services.
Este pastor, al ver lo mucho que estaba trabajando y lo delgado que era, se interesó en mí y me empezó a ayudar.
This pastor, when he saw how hard I was working and how thin I was, he took an interest in me and began to help.
Me dijeron que no hablara con el pastor, amenazaron a palizas si lo hiciera.
I was told not to talk to the pastor, and I was threatened with beatings if I did.
El pastor siguió hablando a mí y el guardia no pudo detenerlo.
The pastor kept talking to me, and the guardian couldn't stop him.
El pastor me trajo cosas que necesitaba como ropa, alimentos.
The pastor brought me things that I needed, like clothing and food.
Yo ni siquiera tenía zapatos hasta que el pastor me trajo un par.
I didn't even have shoes until the pastor brought me a pair.
Entonces un día los guardianes me dejaron,
One day the guardians left me.
ellos desaparecieron
They disappeared,
y no volvieron.
and they didn't come back.
Creí que tenía miedo de que el pastor, porque él estaba pidiendo un montón. Okay. Entonces un día los guardianes me dejó, ellos desaparecieron y no volvieron.
One day, my guardians had disappeared, and they didn't come back.
Creí que tenía miedo
I believe that they were afraid
de que el pastor, porque el pastor gracias. Muchas preguntas.
I believe that they were afraid of the pastor because the pastor was asking me a lot of questions.
Entonces el pastor me dijo que si podía venir a quedarme con él,
And so the pastor asked me if I would come to stay with him
ir a las escuelas.
and to go to school.
Yo me quedé con el pastor hasta que tenía 20 años. Cuando llegué aquí en la ciudad de Portland, con el pastor vi por primera vez la América que yo había pensado que iba a ver.
I stayed with the pastor until I was 20 years old. When I got to Portland, I saw the America that I thought I was coming to see.
El pastor me ayudó a escribir a la escuela, lo cual fue difícil al principio porque no sabía leer ni escribir mucho todavía.
The pastor helped me enroll in school, which was difficult because I didn't know how to read or write very much.
Fue más difícil para los profesores, pero tuve la oportunidad de aprender español a la mañana, inglés, artes, fotografías, matemáticas, que nunca fue bien.
It was more difficult for the teachers, but I was able to take Spanish in the morning, English, arts, photography, and math, which I was not very good at.
Pensé en regresar a México, pero eso era imposible.
I thought about returning to Mexico, but this was impossible.
Yo no tenía dinero,
I didn't have any money.
yo no sabía cómo llegar hasta ahí.
I didn't know how to get there.
El traficante tenía todos mis documentos.
The trafficker had all of my identity documents.
Identidad, perdón. Para todos los años que he trabajado tan duro, no tenía dinero.
For all those years that I had worked so hard, I had no money.
Yo no tenía la educación,
I
yo no
didn't-
tenía nada.
I didn't have education, I didn't have anything.
Tengo una condición médica
I have
llamada distonia.
a medical condition called dystonia.
Cuando yo era un adolescente, empecé a tener problemas para controlar mis movimientos.
When I was a teenager, I began having problems controlling my movement.
Comenzó a cabo solo a ciertas partes de mi cuerpo, al igual que mi brazo se temblaba y no podía hacer no podía hacer que se detenga.
It started out only in certain parts of my body, like my arm would start shaking and I wouldn't be able to make it stop.
Lo que salía de ser lo suficientemente leve como que podía, como que todavía podía funcionar a pesar de que fue doloroso.
It used to be mild enough that I could still work, even though it was quite painful,
Me causó problemas, perdón.
and it caused me problems.
Pero desde entonces se ha apoderado de mi cuerpo.
But since then it had taken over my body.
Me molestaba más que nada.
It bothers me more than anything.
Para mí el día es como la duración de un mes.
For me, a day is like a month.
Un minuto es como un día.
A minute is like a day.
Ahora estoy recibiendo tratamiento todavía. No he podido hacer un montón de cosas que pude hacer cuando era más joven.
I'm receiving treatment now, but I still can't do a whole bunch of things that I used to be able to do when I was young.
Nadie sabe qué causó la distonía, pero a veces me pregunto si yo tuviera una infancia normal, tal vez no sería así.
Nobody knows what causes dystonia, but sometimes I wonder if I had a normal childhood, if things would be different.
Cuando pienso en lo que he vivido, me siento como si mi vida me robaron.
When I think about what I've lived, I feel like my life has been stolen.
Me llevaron de mi casa golpeando y obligados a trabajar y luego abandonado.
I was taken from my home, beaten, forced to work, and then abandoned.
Yo ya no tengo miedo de la gente que me hicieron pasar esto, pero es difícil para mí hablar y recordar.
I'm no longer afraid of the people who did this to me, but it is difficult for me to talk about and to remember.
Yo no los odio tampoco, realmente no tengo ningún sentimiento en ello.
I don't hate them either. I don't really have any feelings about it.
Era mi pasado y ahora estoy enfocado en mi futuro.
That was my past, and I am now focused on my future.
Sin embargo, comparto mi historia con ustedes hoy para que tengan una mejor comprensión de lo que significa ser víctima de trabajadores en este país.
But I share my story with you today so you'll have a better understanding of what it means to be a victim of labor trafficking in this country.
Gracias por escucharme.
Thank you for listening to me.
Gracias. Now we're going to hear from Anna Shishelsky. So, Anna?
As Kyle said, my name is Anna Chishilsky, and I'm an immigration attorney at Immigration Counseling Service, which is a nonprofit legal services organization that has been providing immigration-related legal services to immigrants in our community for the past 30 years. I've worked with Keith for the past 5 years on a number of trafficking cases. I think it's safe to say that our goals, two of our principal goals here is to limit human trafficking as well as to provide support to victims of trafficking. And immigration attorneys play an important role in furthering those goals. And the two most important things that I think immigration attorneys bring to the table with trying to limit human trafficking and provide services for victims of trafficking is, one, immigration attorneys facilitate communication between law enforcement and between victims of human trafficking. The other important role that immigration attorneys play is assisting victims of trafficking with immigration-related issues that they have. So I want to talk about both of the ways that immigration attorneys further these goals and in more detail. The first being how immigration attorneys facilitate communication between victims of trafficking and law enforcement. We can all agree that law enforcement plays a very crucial role in limiting human trafficking. They're the people responsible for arresting the traffickers, putting them in jail, but they can't do that without the stories of the victims, without the victims coming forward and being willing to talk about what happened to them. Traffickers generally use law enforcement as an added threat to their victims of trafficking. So they tell victims of trafficking, don't go to the police. If the police find you, they're going to arrest you, they're going to deport you, you're here illegally, that's a criminal offense. And so victims of trafficking are very worried about coming forward and having any interaction with law enforcement. And so one of the crucial things that immigration attorneys do is that they meet with victims of trafficking and they really explain the protections that are available to them, and they facilitate conversations. I sit in on many of the intakes that Keith does with my clients, and I otherwise think the clients wouldn't come forward and be willing to share their stories without knowing that they had an advocate in the room who was looking out for their interest and had really talked through all of the risks of what was going to happen in the meeting with law enforcement. So the second way that I think immigration attorneys are really crucial to providing support to victims of trafficking is through providing legal services related assistance to victims of trafficking. One of the big fears of victims of trafficking is their safety, and they're afraid that if they are arrested and deported, that they're not going to be safe back in their home country, either because the home country doesn't have laws that protect them, the traffickers are still there, there's a whole host of reasons. And so one of the things that victims are very concerned about is their ability to remain safe. And for most people that means remaining in the United States. The immigration laws are very complicated, and it takes an immigration attorney to be able to explain the law to victims of trafficking as well as assist them throughout the process of applying for any kind of related relief that's available to them. So the number one issue I see for connecting victims of trafficking with immigration attorneys is basically that there's no one contact point. There's no one central organization currently that's able to be a reference point for victims of trafficking. So if a victim of trafficking is identified, there is no one place to send that victim to be able to make contact with an immigration attorney besides law enforcement. And so we've talked about the limitations of law enforcement being the first point of contact. So I think it is a big detriment to victims of trafficking. We used to have Catholic Charities that had a comprehensive legal services program that assisted with both the legal needs as well as some of the other housing and needs like that, but their funding wasn't renewed. And so we have a gaping hole in terms of services that we can provide for victims of trafficking. So currently, we have basically an ad hoc group of attorneys that are willing to donate their time to represent victims of trafficking. And those ad hoc attorneys are brought on board basically through Keith. So Keith identifies a victim, someone reaches out to him, and then he calls one of us and sees who's available to be able to help and represent the person. But it's sort of a backdoor way to get the person the initial services that he or she may need to feel comfortable coming forward to law enforcement. So we're missing a lot of people who don't feel comfortable making that first step of contacting law enforcement. So in terms of solutions or ways that I think this commission can help combat human trafficking is to either help secure funding for a program like this, to work together to try to find the resources so that there is a central point of contact, or also facilitating a more permanent or structured group of attorneys, so that there is one point of contact, there is one place that victims can reach out to and know that the first person they're going to talk to is someone who's going to be advocating for them and for their needs and looking out for their interest.
Tyler, can we ask questions?
Yeah.
I imagine you work throughout the region, not just in the city of Portland, is that right?
Our clients come from all over.
All over the region.
Yes.
And how many clients do you work with in a year in the capacity you just talked about?
And with trafficking, victims of trafficking?
Can you repeat the question? We can't hear.
Yes, how many victims of trafficking have I worked with in the year? I would say since January, Keith and I have worked on maybe 10 trafficking cases. It's just the tip of the iceberg. They're women who've walked into crisis shelters, and the crisis center has called us. People who I see in consultations that had no idea that there was such thing as trafficking, that was a crime. They seem to come from all over.
You just answered my next question, which was, besides through Keith, there must be other ways that people must approach groups like Catholic Charities, and then you refer to the attorneys that are.
So, when Catholic Charities was operating a comprehensive services program for survivors of trafficking, generally what would happen was that survivors were identified most of the time by either immigration attorneys who were just in the process of doing a regular intake with somebody who came to them saying they had an immigration issue, identified the person as potentially being a victim of human trafficking, or often by just general members of the community. We've had numerous referrals come into us from somebody who said, I've encountered this person, they've told me a little bit of their story, I don't really know what's going on, but it sounds kind of like an area that you guys have worked in, and then we will sit down with the person and start working with them. Nowadays, that system has gotten significantly more complicated, as Anna mentioned. Without one agency and one non-law enforcement point of intake, we're still getting those intakes, and so we're kind of working basically as a point of intake for other agencies throughout Portland and throughout the state, where they'll call us and say, I'm working with somebody who I think is exhibiting characteristics of being a potential victim of human trafficking. At that point, I'll go through a couple more screening questions with them to get a better idea of what's going on. And then I will talk to one of the immigration attorneys who's donating their time and say, based on the screening that I've done and what I've heard from this agency, it sounds like this person could potentially be a victim of human trafficking. And then we'll facilitate getting them in to see an immigration attorney. But obviously that's not an ideal system. Whereas in previous years, we would simply say, all right, we'll schedule a time to meet with this person, and we might go out to meet with that person at that agency. They might come into our office, but the system is broken now. There's a huge gap there.
I don't mean to dominate, I just have one more question to ask. I would imagine we just heard this very sad and difficult story, and had there not been a generous person involved, there might have been a different end to that story. I'm wondering, I imagine that if somebody's being trafficked, they don't have any money, they don't have anything, they don't have a home, they don't have food. Is there every random agency in the city taking care of those people? Is there, I was just thinking like before they can go to a lawyer, they have to have some clothes,
Well, again, you've hit the primary issue on the head there, which is that, when Catholic Charities was operating a comprehensive victim services program, what we would do is We do a lot of training with social service agencies throughout the state, with immigration attorneys throughout the state. We're a small team, myself as the program coordinator, an immigration attorney on staff who just worked only human trafficking cases, and a bilingual English and Spanish case manager who would spend her time at Catholic Charities doing nothing but providing services and advocacy to survivors of trafficking. In our capacity providing that training and outreach, we would go out to different service organizations and potential first responders and give them that information so that they could just immediately pick up the phone at the first sign of somebody potentially being a victim of human trafficking and meet them where they're at. These days, we are still getting those phone calls, but it's a lot harder. So yes, a lot of agencies around the state are scrapping to provide services that they don't necessarily have the funding to provide, they're ill-equipped to provide, because there is no one program to do that that's designed to do that.
Yeah, I'll go ahead.
On top of the related assistance, what kind of assistance do you help with? And does it include residency or not being looked at as a criminal? What is it?
So the legal assistance that we provide is actually following the person through the immigration process of applying for legal status, so applying for a visa, which then makes them eligible for additional benefits, getting them a work permit, helping them make that transition. And then after a period of time with the visa, they are eligible for their green card for residency and then on to citizenship. And so we...
What kind of chances is it that they won't get that?
That they won't get the visa?
Yeah.
Every case is very different. With the cases that we take, and I think a lot of the immigration attorneys right now, because resources are so limited, we take sort of only the strongest of the strongest cases. And so once there's once the victim has come forward and once there's been cooperation with law enforcement, a key component to the trafficking visa is that law enforcement signs a certification saying that the person was helpful and has cooperated. And once that is there in the record, immigration, I would say generally approves those visas. I think there's a very good chance.
There was a question on the aisle back here, and then we'll go to Hector last.
I have two questions. First one is, what do you guys think is the percentage split between people, like the gentleman who spoke earlier, who was specifically taken from his home country and brought to the United States for the purpose of labor trafficking, and people who come into the United States either voluntarily and then become involved in the trafficking, stuff that's happening up here?
In my experience, and this is just based on the cases that I've done, so there's no empirical research to back this up, the majority of cases that I see are people who are brought from their home country to the United States for the purpose of trafficking, so that they're found in their home country and brought here, and the plan is already in place.
Right. My second question is, have you guys made efforts to reach out to migrant Head Start programs specifically, because they have very direct contact with these communities and understand where the camps are located, including the secret ones that people don't know about, and have good relationships with those communities?
I think that's a good question for you, Ray.
Well, this more harkens back to my experience before getting to this job, in that I spent 5 years going out to labor camps because legal services, law enforcement, churches have access to labor camps. But what Keith's saying is absolutely correct, that OSHA or BOLI keeps this list of registered labor camps, but in going out, for every one that we found that was registered, along the way we would find 2 others that weren't, and those were the worst circumstances. And I think that Senor Ramirez, his story presents all of the obstacles that you're going to face from the get-go. Someone who doesn't speak the language, is very vulnerable, is isolated. These labor camps, more often than not, are out in the country. Very few services get out there. Legal Services, another program that is very, very underfunded, tries to get to as many of those camps across the state, but literally even the ones that are registered are hard to get to, and they collaborate with Head Start programs and community partners. But I'll tell you that in the 10 years that I've represented immigrant workers, this is a tough issue. You put your heart on the line when you come out and you reveal the story. There is total vulnerability. And in Senor Ramirez's case, he doesn't, at that stage, doesn't even speak a language where he can communicate his needs to others. And people capitalize on that. And that is a problem that persists today. The labor camps are still, I believe, a breeding ground for trafficking that we have only touched the surface on. And the only thing I can equate this issue to is look at where we were with domestic violence and sexual assault and how long it took us to identify the problem, develop a response to that problem, get the resources to address the problem, a law enforcement coordinated response with victims advocates. This takes time, and it's the same issue that we're facing here. Trafficking has come into our consciousness. And I echo the belief that yes, there's more that can be done on domestic sex trafficking, absolutely. The response has been, to your point, is not even close when it comes to foreign-born. And who knows what factors play into that, whether it's sympathies within the community or lack of sympathy for undocumented populations. But we need to catch up, and we need to develop that response. So we're here today to talk about how the HRC can help with this process. I would say that one of the biggest barriers is you've got Keith and Chris here who are going across the state. They're two individuals, and they are tremendous individuals. I've had the pleasure of working with these two. It's not enough. There are not enough resources to this issue. Getting the word out alone is something that this commission could play a vital role in doing, in helping to develop a coordinated response where everybody's collaborating, because no one component is more important than the other. Law enforcement isn't the end-all be-all. Social service providers, immigration providers, they all need to come together, but that collaborative response is not there yet. And that's the goal that we all need to work towards.
Hector, you had a question?
Yes, in 17 parts. Señor Ramírez López, tantas gracias por su presentación. El corazón, muchísimas gracias. In terms of collaboration, I assume that Oregon is a long ways from the border, or borders, depending on which people come from. Do you collaborate at all with other bodies similar to you in that pathway, California, Arizona, New Mexico? And if so, how do you do so? And the final part of this is there any work being done with the countries of origin?
One thing just to say before and there's probably all of us can address a different question, is that while we are from some ways away from Mexico and Canada, where we share a land border, Portland is a port of entry for Asian communities, and so a lot of Asian victims come through Portland as a first destination on plane trips from there. So it is a border in some sense.
Ask your question about collaborating with other similar programs in other states. We are lucky in that when we were funded by a federal grant through the U.S. Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime, there are a number of grantees around the country, and there are many challenges to being a federal grantee, and there are many blessings to being a federal grantee. And one of the really phenomenal things about receiving funding from the federal government is that you do get to network with these other organizations throughout the United States that do the exact same work that you do. And in that sense, you get an idea of best practices for serving survivors of human trafficking, labor trafficking, sex trafficking, and you also really get to hear about different, for lack of a better way to put it, trends in trafficking that we're seeing. So I've worked with service providers out of the state of Utah that we're seeing folks being brought to the United States for the purposes of very, very rural sheep herding. And they called me and said, are you seeing this population? Because we're seeing folks who are being forced to work in these trailers. If they ever try and leave, they're chased down by guard dogs. And they've been in this situation for many, many years. And I can then get on the phone and start calling people in Washington and start calling people in California and start calling people in Wyoming and Montana and say, this is a trend that seems to be developing, and then call colleagues in Eastern Oregon and say, we're seeing this in these other areas. And sure enough, when you get that information out there, people will say, yeah, actually, we have been seeing those cases, and we thought we were the only one. So yes, we try very hard to collaborate with partners, especially in areas where we know that there are known trafficking corridors. The I-5 corridor, absolutely a well-known trafficking corridor. And similarly with that particular case involving sheep herders, I-84, right down to Salt Lake City, right up to Portland.
Okay, we're going to stay on schedule, and now that we've gotten used to hearing Chris Kilmer talk, if he has any prepared comments for us, we can go ahead and get those now from you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'll try and keep my prepared comments pretty short because I'm finding that the Q&A is really the best part of this program. So I'd really like to continue along that trend. So as you've heard from your questions and from my fellow panelists here, until November of 2011, Catholic Charities maintained a comprehensive services program for survivors, immigrant survivors of human trafficking. And what that meant was that we provided, through a small staff of 3 individuals, comprehensive social services and also free immigration legal services to individuals identified as being foreign-born victims of human trafficking under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And through that program, we would work with our community partners, social service community partners, immigration attorneys, to identify survivors of human trafficking and begin to work with them on both their immigration legal issue and also on the social services component. Anna's already covered the importance of the immigration legal issue there, so I won't delve into that. But I will say that the immigration attorneys who we're working with right now are strained. Immigration law is complicated. There is a huge need for immigration attorneys in this state, in this country. And the folks who we're working with are taking these cases free of charge, and trafficking cases are challenging. They take time and they take effort, and God bless them for the work that they're doing. But we need something in place to continue to work with survivors of trafficking because the importance of that immigration advocacy is massive. The other component of the program, and the part that I'll speak to, is comprehensive social services. There's a misconception, I think, that you can apply for a visa and it'll get processed relatively quickly. And the fact of the matter is that trafficking visas take time to apply for. They take time to be processed and adjudicated. And during that period of time, we're working with survivors who have oftentimes literally run away from their situation with the clothes on their backs. They do not have any financial support. They have no documentation. They are often extremely traumatized from their trafficking experience. And they need somewhere to go to. And the role that Catholic Charities has traditionally played is being that stable, one-stop shop support mechanism for that population. The services that we've provided are very broad. The biggest service that we provide to survivors of trafficking really is just advocacy. Survivors of trafficking have so many needs, from medical needs to mental health needs, and while those immigration legal services are being worked out, the population really needs somewhere to go to just experience some stability, to have a case manager who can sit with them and help them with finding a place to live, with grocery store gift cards that they're able to eat. They can't work legally in the United States, so they have no source of income. Obviously, that further creates challenges for the particular population that we're talking about. Medical needs are often huge. Survivors of trafficking really have varying medical needs, but often they've been denied medical care for the entire period of time that they've been in their trafficking situation. The last thing that a trafficker wants to do is bring the person who they are victimizing into a medical facility, because it's going to be apparent fairly quickly that person is a victim of a crime. We've seen physical trauma. Obviously, we see cases often involving sexual assault. We have seen cases where folks have had major challenges with vision, with hearing, because they've been in completely substandard working conditions with loud machinery in the background, or they've been forced to live and work in extremely dark basements and warehouses. I mean, it's the stuff of nightmares, and it exhibits itself often in these medical conditions that need to be dealt with. And so Catholic Charities will do a lot of advocacy in trying to secure free or low-cost medical care for this population. Same thing with mental health and psychological care. Survivors of trafficking often have, understandably, ongoing mental health needs as a result of the extraordinary trauma that they have been through. Trauma that started in the home country, perhaps, and has just been exacerbated by this awful trafficking situation that they've been in. And so really our role is to stabilize that person, provide them with a one-stop shop where they can go to. They know they can always call us, and we will be there for any need that they have. And that's incredibly important for the survivor, for recovery, and also for immigration attorneys who are trying to get this person the immigration advocacy and the immigration relief that they deserve in the United States. But that can be very challenging to do when that person doesn't have a place to live. And they're coming to you and telling you their extremely traumatic story, but they haven't had anything to eat in 2 or 3 days. And so that's really the role that we have been playing and the role that we would like to continue to play. To get to the questions and there have been a few questions about the numbers of survivors. The fundamental challenge with numbers and this population is that it is a hidden population, as was talked about with labor camps. But we're not just talking about labor camps. I've worked with folks who have been forced to work in elder care facilities for numerous years. I've worked with survivors who were in restaurants, in the backs of restaurants, and were not being paid, and their families back in their home countries were being threatened, so they weren't able to leave the situation for fear that their family would be hurt or killed. I've worked with folks who were brought over and forced into domestic servitude in private homes, and it was only when the person who was forcing them to work 20 hours a day, taking care of their children and cleaning the house, accidentally left the gate unlocked that these individuals were able to escape their situation, and by the goodness of a random passerby recognizing that that person was experiencing some form of trauma, picked that person up and eventually called us. So my point is that it's a very hidden population, and when you're dealing with a very hidden population, it's extremely hard to get numbers. So we obviously know the number of survivors that we've worked with, and that was during the course of 2011 through 2012, or 2010 through 2011, somewhere around 60 survivors of trafficking. That population also is not limited to just being female, which is a common misconception, that a lot of these folks are sex trafficked. I would say that our population was approximately 60% women, 40% men, and probably about 65% of the population that we worked with was from Latin America. The rest of the population has been from all around the world. I've worked with folks from the Middle East, I've worked with folks from Africa, I've worked with folks from East Asia, from South Asia, from Southeast Asia, every corner of the globe. So this is not a phenomenon that's limited to one region. It's not a phenomenon that's limited to males or females. I've worked with senior citizens, and I've worked with children, and everything in between. So this is a a broader issue, I think, than people tend to see it as. And the numbers are hard. The numbers are very, very challenging. In terms of what the Human Rights Commission can do, I think that my fellow panelists have really nailed it on the head, which is to say that this issue is not talked about, unfortunately. I think that commonly right now, if you ask a Portlander about human trafficking, they're going to talk to you about the commercial sexual exploitation and domestic minor sex trafficking, and I'm deeply grateful that that issue has gotten as much attention as it has, because 5 years ago when I started doing this work, people weren't even talking about that at all. So that is phenomenal, and we're so lucky, while much more needs to be done, that that issue has taken off and that it is at the forefront of people's minds when they talk about the issue, but we are missing a large population that needs to be recognized, and that is that there are foreign-born victims out there, and they are basically invisible, and they need support of people in the community to say, this is a real problem, and we have real cases out there. So with that, I'll just open it up for questions.
I have a statement.
Please.
When speaking with Linda Smith of Shared Hope, not to put a number on it, but she said Oregon was a D. So when you hear these numbers of 66 that they've served, it's nice because they're coming and being trustworthy, but we're at a D. So that should tell you right there, for Oregon being a D, we're slightly passing. And so when we're out there and we're talking to people and we're trying to let them know how to improve, what would you suggest the steps are to begin improving what you want? You want us all to work together. You want to work with other small organizations that are posted out there. There are a lot out there that are small organizations that are speaking out about it, but how do we get together? And this is what I thought was going to happen tonight, was to be able to communicate from one place. But when you say that you want a one-stop shop, that's a cookie cutter. And when you do a cookie cutter, you won't meet the needs of everyone. So how is that going to work for a one-stop shop? For victims that you want to reach that you don't know about that are out there?
I'll try and address that because you ask the tough questions, and when we use the term one-stop shop, really I think it encompasses more the idea that we need a strategic response that is coordinated among everyone, and right now we simply don't have that. We had one organization that was the anchor for all these victims and provided technical assistance across the state, and it is wholly underfunded. So now we're grappling with, okay, how can we be strategic about this? How do we create protocols that everyone can use and streamline the process so that no one slips through the gaps? And that is what we tackle with. On the trafficking task force, I served with Keith on the foreign-born task force, and we have proposed over time protocols for identifying the points of entry, each place that potentially you're going to find a trafficking victim, whether it's through enforcement removal operations, through county, local, jails, coming through social services, healthcare providers, and then once we identify all those sources, get the word out that there is an institutionalized or at least a structure in place where you can refer people, and hopefully when we improve on the process, it becomes a seamless process where we get people all the needs that they have along the line. And leading up to prosecution, although I'm a firm believer that prosecution has a role and purpose, but it is not the end result and the end-all be-all, that you get justice for your victim, you put the trafficker away, you create public awareness, and potentially you get immigration relief through that avenue. But what we struggle with is we never get people, well, I shouldn't say never, it is hard to get through the gauntlet to even get somebody to law enforcement based on all these barriers. So there is no clear answer, and certainly I don't think that this forum will answer it, but this is the beginning of a discussion, a serious discussion about what we need to do as the community to develop this response and work all together. And it is a tough issue that we have struggled with over time. When I first met, Chris, the OSIP program, this was 10 years ago when they had first gotten money, and we sat down at that time and talked about protocols, and this was when the issue was really more amorphous. There was really no clear indicator that there was trafficking going on or in what form it was taking, and over the years they have developed the knowledge and the ability to address these needs, but we backslide when we hit economic crisis and institutions are no longer funded, then all the progress that's made slides back a bit. So now we're here to discuss how we now move this forward, and we have to figure that out with very little resources to do so.
Does anyone else on the panel have any response to that question? I think that's a really good question, and it's a question that speaks to one of the purposes of this hearing, which is to bring interested stakeholders and people together to have a common place to talk about this. So is there anything else that needs to be said about that?
I would just make a follow-up comment in terms of, one of the things that I see as really important is having a sort of organized group of attorneys, immigration attorneys specifically, to be able to respond. And part of that is handing out a list of telephone numbers to individuals to be able to try to access legal services is not an effective way to get those services to the people. So I definitely agree that there are many community partners, and the way that victims are identified and get set up with the services they need is through the community partners. And we need to identify those community partners, work together to get people referred, but we need to also have a place for them to be referred to. And at the moment, we just lack the place to send them. So even if we identify someone, it's hard to respond with, well, here's the name of 5 attorneys. They've said they've been maybe willing to take, a case and help you. Call them, see if you can set up a consultation. It's just, it's too daunting to be able to provide the services.
Donna.
Excuse me for being late. I was out educating a child. My name is Donna Maxey, so since I'm late, I'm going to ask 3 questions. One of our speaker mentioned that he had sounded like neurological damage. And so I'm thinking that since we're trying to get information and deal with this, that maybe we need to be looking at the spraying of crops while workers are there. I want to know what's going on with that. Also, it was mentioned that funding is very difficult to get, and the question that I have is, once they are rescued, what happens to the people? I understand that it's difficult, and someone mentioned that they don't have any legal status, so they can't work. So what have we rescued them from? For what purpose? I mean, I understand we're rescuing them so that they have freedom. But are we putting them in another form of purgatory by rescuing them without services and money to support them? And so what can we do along those lines, and what is being done? Another question, you were asked about your working with people in terms of the countries of origin. Are you working with the Salvation Army? I know about a year or 2 ago there was a speaker who was here who worked with the International Salvation Army and was working on the issue of human trafficking. So that seems like a place that we should be connected, and do we need to be connecting with them? So that was simple. So just jump in.
Yeah, I think speak to the latter 2 of the questions that you had. Once again, you've identified a primary problem there when you say, well, okay, great, we've got this person, they're presenting as a victim of human trafficking, we've got them now an immigration attorney, but are they now in kind of this purgatory whereby they can't work? And that really was the primary role of the OSIP program, was to provide that stability. So we would provide rental assistance, we would provide grocery store gift cards, and then we would provide advocacy for the person so that they could advocate for themselves and connect them to different services for which they were eligible. One of the things about the T visa, which is a visa specifically for victims of human trafficking, is that once a survivor receives a T visa, they actually they don't get the same status as a refugee, but they then are eligible to receive the same benefits as a refugee receives in the United States. So what that means is that we can connect them to a refugee resettlement program, which luckily Catholic Charities is one of 3 agencies in the state of Oregon that provides refugee resettlement services. And that refugee resettlement program will then connect them with the benefits for which they're eligible as refugees, essentially. So at that point, they become significantly more stable in terms of being able to access services. And they get 8 months of those refugee benefits, 8 months of job training, and medical benefits. So that's huge. That makes a very big difference. The second half of your question involving connecting to other organizations, in particular the Salvation Army. Salvation Army is one of the very first organizations that I started working with 5 years ago. They have a long-standing interest in the issue of human trafficking and a lot of great professional experience around the country serving survivors of human trafficking, doing advocacy around the issue. So yes, we work with the Salvation Army. We work with any organization that has the potential to identify, serve, or really has an interest in the issue of human trafficking. We'll work with them. We'll provide training to them. We will connect them to our partners in law enforcement. We will connect them to immigration attorneys, because no one organization can do this on their own. And yes, you do need a place or a group of people through which you can have, or victims can access services, but it is a collaborative effort, 100%.
I can try and address the labor camp issue if I understand the question, which was, you know, what can we do? Spring is coming, right? So the growing season here does start in around March, you know, berries moving up the valley to apples by October. But people stay here and throughout the winter season to do pruning. So there's still workers throughout the years and throughout the whole year. What we can do to, I think, improve the response is we realistically can't create a new resource. We need to piggyback on existing resources. The ones that typically you're going to see out in the labor camps are going to be low-income legal services. Legal Aid, Oregon Law Center, my former employer, does mass outreach to labor camps. Now there is some hesitation because Keith and I have gone to talk to legal services about, hey, maybe we could do outreach, but I'm going to be honest in saying that despite the fact that I may be bilingual, I now work for a government agency, and that definitely doesn't bode well when you go out to a labor camp. As a nonprofit attorney, I was asked, do you work for the government? You know, so there's tremendous suspicion, even when healthcare providers go out there. So again, the coordinated response, you know, religious organizations have access, working with those that go out to the camps to provide services, help, and also, you know, as I was thinking about the response to the question, you know, those agencies that go out there and are charged with inspection, whether it be USDOL, I thought it represented here earlier, or BOLI or OSHA, when you go out to labor camps, there are usually postings that are, you know, the employer is required to provide, which is, you know, these are your OSHA rights, you know, these are your fair labor standard wage rights, and potentially, you know, having it be the case where you're obligated to list, you know, human trafficking resources if, you know, we had our pie in the sky and could do whatever we want so that workers could see it in multiple languages. But again, farm labor camps, we are talking about populations that now more so than ever are largely indigenous populations, and they speak in Mixteco, Zapoteco. These are not even written languages. Many are not even written languages, so it's very hard to communicate with these populations. It's not insurmountable, but again, it is a coordinated response with everybody who has a stake in it.
And the signs sound wonderful, but like the gentleman said, he can't read. He couldn't read.
Right, exactly. So
you know, so
what we used to do in legal services is we used to do kind of we had a couple ways that we would address it. And one was going out and doing presentations in Spanish, like teatro, like theater, to talk, somebody would play the grower, and actually it was somebody from Catholic Charities who would always play the grower, and then, somebody who, would be a worker who was going to ask for their wages to demonstrate what the legal right was. And the other way that we were able to do it, drawing from other programs out of the state, like California Rural Legal Assistance, was cartoons, that, you could demonstrate it visually. So you have to get creative.
And there are other solutions too. Keith and I have gone down and spoken on the radio, Cocoon Radio, which then broadcasts and is often listened to by many of the farm worker communities out there. And there was a lot of translation involved. I believe it was English to Spanish to Trique. But we do our best to get the information out there in as many languages as is possible.
We have time for one more question before moving on to our next guest. Myra has had her hand up the longest, so go ahead, Myra.
My question is, I guess for any of you or all of you, and I'm interested in learning about the children. So what happens with the babies or kids that are born into that situation, that maybe the parents are working in the farms or working in these conditions and they have kids. So I know from some Head Starts and OCDCs that is something that they're looking into, that the kids are brought into the camps because there's no, they either work, the parents have to work, so they can't leave their children, and there's no sunblock, they're under these conditions working. And so how do you see that, and what are you doing, or what can be done around that?
I can say that Head Start plays a pivotal role. There were plenty of times that I went out to labor camps where the kids weren't in a Head Start program and they were literally just running around, and hopefully there was one older sibling that was watching the kids, because during the day, their parents are working, and there are child labor laws that I think most growers would probably be smart enough to avoid, so I have not necessarily seen a lot of kids in the fields, but they're very young. I'm talking babies. I mean, you're seeing kids in the sense that you're seeing kids in junior high school and high school who actually speak English quite well, who are coming in with their parents, or their parents have now settled here and they're going out to the camps in the summers and they're working, and they're equally vulnerable to those circumstances as well.
And you do raise a really important point, though, that children are the most invisible of the population in terms of victims of trafficking. As Valentino was talking about, he didn't get out of it basically until he was older, because children are completely incapable of making any of those phone calls or seeking out resources for themselves. And when there's a parent involved, there is hopefully at least some kind of advocate. But a lot of the children don't even have parents involved, and children come to this country very young. They leave their home country when they're 10, 11 years old, escaping a lot of the gang violence that's going on, a lot of the tough working conditions that are going on, and no one sees them. They're very hidden, and it's a huge challenge in terms of recognizing and reaching out to them. And I don't think we've even really started to address the problem in the way that we need to.
I'm not sure if they remember this, but the last time I met with all of the panelists, they agreed to stick around after to answer questions that anybody might have that they didn't get to ask. So I hate to hold you to that, everybody, but if you do have a question that you haven't gotten to ask and you remember it at the end of this, I think that they would be happy to answer those questions, hopefully. But I'd like to welcome U.S. Attorney Jane Shoemaker up to make a few comments. Jane has been a federal prosecutor for over 23 years and has been with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Portland for 4.5 years. She's currently the chief of the Violent Crimes Unit, which handles traditional violent crimes and also child exploitation and sex trafficking. Jane has agreed to provide us with an update on the work of the U.S. Attorney's Office with regard to human trafficking. So, Jane.
Thank you for the introduction and the invitation to speak here tonight. I'm really in a completely different situation than all the other speakers you've heard from tonight, because I haven't had any experience prosecuting or investigating human trafficking cases on either the foreign-born side or the domestic sex trafficking. So you might be asking yourselves, well, why am I here? I'm here as a representative of our office to let everyone know that our office considers human trafficking to be a top priority, particularly now with our new U.S. Attorney, Amanda Marshall. Dwight Holton was the interim U.S. Attorney until this past October when Amanda Marshall became the U.S. Attorney. And actually, Dwight first made the human trafficking a priority in our office. And he asked our then human trafficking coordinator to conduct training on both the sex trafficking and the foreign-born human labor trafficking issues, and to invite people, not only other law enforcement agents, but also what we call or NGOs or non-government organizations, social service providers, and so on, people in the community to come together for a forum, and it was really more of an educational type of seminar to educate people on the problems and to generate discussion and get people to work together to address the problem, and hopefully generate some referrals for cases in our office. And he had training in the spring and again in October, right after Amanda Marshall was sworn in as the U.S. Attorney, and they were widely attended and well received. But since that time, when Amanda came in and took over, she's made a number of changes in our office that I think are going to be really yield hopefully some good results, and I think bring new energy to this area in our office. Human trafficking is one of Amanda's top 3 priorities in the office, along with Indian country cases and cases involving sexual exploitation of children, whether it's sex trafficking of minors or online enticement or possession, distribution, or production of images of child sexual abuse. What Amanda has envisioned, and Amanda has a lot of energy, and she has a lot of great ideas, and she is really, from what I've seen so far, she's a person who wants to seek results. She wants to make things happen and not just talk about making these things priorities and not really doing anything about it. One of the things that she's recently done is decided to separate the people who are prosecuting and overseeing cases in our office that deal with the sex trafficking, domestic sex trafficking, versus the foreign-born labor trafficking, because we really look at these things as 2 different animals. They have 2 different, really different types of issues, and these cases are investigated in a different way, and frankly, how quickly they're going to go through the system, the kinds of issues that are involved with the foreign-born, involving all these immigration issues that we don't normally see, obviously, with the domestic sex trafficking cases. So what we saw is that the domestic sex trafficking seemed to be primarily gang-related. So she's moved the domestic sex trafficking cases into the gang unit and added 2 other federal prosecutors to that unit, 2 of our most aggressive prosecutors in the office. And they are now already, just in the last, we started this, I want to say, I think it was in February when we made this change. And we already have a number of new indictments and investigations going in that area, and I mean, the results are already amazing. On the foreign-born labor trafficking side, Amanda has decided to put that under the umbrella of our civil rights prosecutor, who is Hannah Horsley. Hannah has been the civil rights coordinator since she came to the office a little bit before me. I actually know Hannah from prior U.S. attorneys' offices where we've worked. Hannah's had extensive training in civil rights cases. She's got the contacts at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. She's going to start attending the Oregon Human Trafficking Task Force meetings and wants to be an active participant in that. She's going to reach out to other U.S. attorneys' offices around the country that have had success in developing these investigations and prosecuting them to find out what they're doing in those other districts that we maybe could be doing in this district and at least in our office that we haven't been doing yet. At this point, we don't have any pending indictments that are in our office. We're looking forward to working with the task force and hopefully working at the investigative stage to develop leads, figure out ways that we might be able to identify victims out there and how we might be able to build cases. As the speaker we heard tonight, when he talked about his situation and how the way he was able to escape from this was when his guardians disappeared. One of you, I'm sorry, I mentioned a minute ago, it might have been you, Chris, of talking about a domestic servant who was only able to escape when the family left the gate unlocked by accident. In some cases, when a victim of human trafficking is able to escape, they're not always able to identify who the trafficker is, and they often aren't in a position where they can provide leads that we can follow up. So it may be that the task force has encountered a number of victims where at least they've been able to provide services for them, but maybe it hasn't been able to result in a prosecution. We're hoping that with our active participation in the task force and with everybody coming together and putting more energy into this issue, that we may be able to successfully prosecute some of these traffickers, who they are. They are difficult cases, just from the things that I've learned about it, just in training and from listening to all the stories and issues that have been raised tonight. They take time, but we want to offer whatever assistance we can. One thing Amanda really wanted to emphasize is her belief, and I share this, and it sounds like all of you do as well, that one of the most important things we can do to combat this issue is to bring everyone together. Instead of having this proliferation of different task forces all individually trying to work on the same goal separately, what we think is more effective is if everybody will come together to share their knowledge, share their ideas. Amanda's all about collaboration, and so I think that is one of the keys that we need to work these cases. Another thing I think we need to focus on is getting involved, and our office getting involved in the process as well, having the referrals made when you have a case, you encounter victims where this activity is ongoing, where we may be able to go in and do something proactive, or where we may be able to go in and find other leads. Unfortunately, I know some of these cases, they come to your attention after the fact, where you don't necessarily have a trafficker identified where they are, you don't have locations, there may be isolated reports, and it's hard to follow up those leads and develop a prosecution, and at least you're able to provide the services. That's another thing that we're interested in. I mean, our goal is obviously, as the U.S. Attorney's Office, one of our goals is to prosecute these cases. But we also are interested in ensuring that the victims are provided the services that they need. And we're willing to do whatever we can to help. And Hannah is going to be your primary contact if you have cases that you want to refer for prosecution. Hannah will be involved with the task force to help come up with ideas of what can be done. Hannah will probably be the person prosecuting those cases, at least the initial prosecutions that we get. At a certain point, if she's on overload, we'll have to spread those to other people, whether it's also going to be from some of the prosecutors who are doing the domestic trafficking cases, or whether there are other prosecutors in our office. But we'll ensure that whoever is doing those cases gets the appropriate training to do them. And we want to provide whatever resources we have to support you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. So now's the time on the agenda that we have. If Diane would like to address any of the points that were just made, or anything that you think that we haven't talked enough about.
I've been further than I already have. So I think one of the key roles that, in terms of the intersect between services and immigration relief, and I can't belabor this point enough, is even, I think the prosecution part is a component of it. I think along the way, how we can help people is by making sure that law enforcement and certifiers of T visas are issuing, when it's appropriate and at the earliest possible juncture, the immigration relief in order to anchor the victim, so that the victim is there for the prosecution at the end of the day. Because as Chris mentioned, along the way, once you get the T certification, you become eligible, and the only way you get the T certification is through law enforcement and prosecutors. So that can be a key role in how we anchor victims here. And obviously, the resources that the U.S. Attorney's Office brings to the table is critically important. As you're hearing here, we are tapped, on funding and resources. So a coordinated response, I think, is very helpful. And other than that, that was my last point that I was going to make.
Does anybody have any questions that they didn't get to ask earlier? I know Abdul had a question.
Actually, I have a comment quickly and then follow up with a question to our wonderful U.S. Attorney. Thank you for coming. One of the things that when you were talking about ads or posters or things like that, one of the things that Keith and some of you mentioned, the big role that plays fear in the person, whatever you give them or you train them or you told them, they will not report, they will not come forward because there's other thing that's worries them as their family is being hostage or things like that. So I just want to make that comment about and sometimes the people who does work in this field, they are advanced than us. They can show them movies or documentaries how corrupted some officers in U.S., how abuse of power with immigrants in U.S. Maybe they are ahead of us to work psychologically on them than us trying to come with that. So I just want to make that comment and hear about it. But one thing I know Keith and always under his leadership has been really dedicating a lot of energy to that. But I keep hearing how certain communication issues or certain support from federal law enforcement, either ICE, FBI, etc. So I'm glad to hear Hannah is dedicated her full time to this and willingness to use resources. I would really like to see an open communication and no more power struggle positioning. This is we are in the power here than Keith or they are just sheriff department. This even sheriff department is important or police department is important. So how can your office to help bring those resources and start exhibiting some partnership and maybe involving a couple of officers under the key leadership in the task force to start really showing, like you said, the new attorney really into it and showing that hard work and want to get in there. How can we get some support from your office in that area? Because I keep hearing that lack of federal support. Thank you.
You don't like the Fed?
Not I don't like the feds.
I'll try to answer your question as best I can. I think what Keith said is true, that sometimes federal agencies don't always get along so well together, depending on the agency that's involved. And it obviously varies depending on who the agents are too. I know that Keith has worked closely with John Gerardo from ICE, or now called HSI, Homeland Security Investigations. I think they have a good working relationship. I'm not sure whether the DEA has been involved in this at all, or whether that would be appropriate, but certainly the FBI, and I don't know what other federal agencies are involved, but one thing I can say is this, that there are always going to be some agents that are more, that may have personality clashes with others, and I don't mean to suggest anything with Keith at all. I think I've heard nothing but good things about him. But we are, as a management team, when we think somebody's not being effective in the field and that maybe there should be a change of agents involved, we speak to the management about that. And we've had recent conversations along those lines. I don't want to say who or in what field or area, but we do that. So what I would suggest is, and I'll talk to Hannah about this to discuss with Keith, but if there are issues where maybe they don't have the right agents working on the task force that we can talk to management about, making some changes there. Or talking with the agents about getting them to, get on board and trying to get everyone to work together. Because it is really important that everybody work together and that we not have this division. And we can't be very effective if, one agency is off trying to do their own thing or maybe kind of putting it to the side. And we need everybody to come together, everybody who has something relevant in their department anyway, to come and work together. So that is something that we'll try to make a priority, to get people to work together, whether they're federal agents, local agents. Amanda's really big on getting everybody together, and she's already doing a lot of that. And I was at a conference last week on another topic, and Amanda had us meeting people that she knew from the Oregon Department of Justice and from all the different local and state agencies. And Amanda, by the way, don't be surprised if she's showing up at your task force meetings and all too, because she's really hands-on, and she's going to want to get in there, and she'll help facilitate cooperative relationships.
Can I add to that point just really quickly?
Sure.
Jane mentioned, and I think that this is a really good approach, is to look at what other states are doing on this issue. How are their task forces structured? Because when I first got on the task force, Keith brought us on a grant to DC to a US DOJ conference where it was focused on domestic or foreign-born trafficking. And we got to meet the task forces from other states, and some states are highly effective in it. The task forces that seemed to succeed were structured in a non-hierarchical form. So you had the stakeholders at the table, law enforcement and non-law enforcement. I think that is very helpful for the integration of ideas between those two groups who may see things very differently. And so maybe consideration of the task force as being a place where NGOs, nonprofit service providers, frontline people are there in collaboration. I understand that there are parts of the communications with prosecutors and law enforcement that need to maintain confidentiality, like case reviews, but I think there is a purpose served in bringing people together to the table to kind of dismantle the hierarchy that may exist, or the perception of one having more value than the other. And I think Amanda is a likely source to usher in a new era in that respect, in that she does come from the state, and as she works for the feds, and she would understand, and your office has in many respects worked in a very collaborative way. So that would be kind of my vision for how the task force progresses.
We got a question from the woman on the aisle.
My name's Yvonne.
Yvonne.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
My question, I just wanted to say and comment how the testimony that was given here today from a person that served in almost indentured servitude, how common it is for those of us who work closely with Spanish-speaking communities, with the Latino community here. In my work in the last 10 years, I've been a paralegal, and also for the last 6 years, I have been a Spanish interpreter at the town hospital here, state hospital here in Florida. And therefore, I get to hear stories, for instance, of women, and this is not private conversation, this is just the chit-chat that you hear of how, children came here speaking Mixtec, little girls who spent, who were 7 and were already working, never paid for, 7 and 9, and were never able to really have any choices of their own. Finally being able to reach adulthood, and then through many, many years, perhaps 20 years, learn Spanish. And these things had been gone, this lives, many, many lives like this have gone unrecognized by, by what they are. The second thing that I wanted to ask is, what are the differences? Perhaps this is too brief of a moment to understand, but I know that there are corporations that are bringing workers from every part of the world, from Panama, from every one of the Spanish-speaking countries, as well as from the Philippines and many other Asian countries. I mean here, I'm sorry, not the Philippines, Thailand. to work in the fields as B2, on their B2 visas. In many of these contractors, they do away with all the contractual promises that they had, and people end up not eating, with very mean in scarcity of, even, a blanket, living in the forest, things like that. And so when does it become, when does this lack or not doing, not respecting the contract becomes then part of this sphere of human trafficking?
Well, historically, you're familiar with Bracero programs, right?
Yes.
And I think that is what many immigration practitioners would take issue with these programs like the H-2A, H-2B programs, where your work, or E-2 programs, where you are tied to an employer, and that visa is connected with that employer, and with that that can be riddled with abuse, because people are very vulnerable if they know that midstream, if they're not, doing what the grower or the employer says, they're going to be canned, and their likelihood is they aren't going to be able to port their visa to another employer, and they're going to be gone, and employers capitalize on that. So that is a huge problem. So I think that, I forget who it was, I think maybe it was Stephen who was saying there are plenty of people who come here legally, but are often the most vulnerable because of those types of programs. And so, one thing, Kyle is an attorney, there are many attorneys in this room. One component of this is the criminal prosecution, the immigration relief, but, I don't want to forget the role that maybe private attorneys can play in litigating the rights of victims to get them civil relief as well.
But that is also trafficking, even if they come on a visa or under this sort of idea that they're here legally working and it's a big corporation, they're still trafficking victims, and there are still rights that are available to them. It's again trying to connect them, trying to get the awareness out there, and then connect them with individuals that are able to help them get out of that situation and make a better life.
Thank you.
We're going to take one more question from this gentleman who's been very patient, and then we have someone signed up for public testimony, so we're going to get to that, and then do the final question and answer period after that. Go ahead.
I was just going to bring up 2 points which might help illuminate the discussion. One is, somebody asked about foreign cooperation in trafficking, and I will tell you that from my experience in the international adoption arena, the cooperation, especially with the UN Treaty on Child Trafficking, has led to almost a collapse in international adoption, and the unwillingness or inability of many countries to comply with the UN resolution on child trafficking, which has meant that there is very little legal adoption going on between the United States and other countries, and countries who are signatories to that. However, I also, within the last month, heard the cost of actually buying children in Asia. It's phenomenal. You can buy a young boy in Bangladesh for $500. You can buy an undocumented refugee, orphan, Burmese refugee in this case, for $50 for a girl. So obviously there's a glut on the market. And whether it's legal or it's illegal, it's happening, and there's a tsunami of children being purchased and distributed around the world that is coming into action.
And I was just told that I have rudely ignored the woman on the end here. Sorry about that. Why don't you go ahead?
But I always forget. What I wanted to ask, and I think that the person somewhat asked something similar to this earlier, I'm not sure. But when the young man was up and he was telling his story, he was also educating us. So I am wondering whether or not the task force is looking at the victims as becoming educators. Meaning that besides telling their story, they're also developing the skills to be able, to help themselves, but also not only just on the local level, but but also on the international level, in terms of, you know, possibly reaching their population and trying to help them to understand that when someone approaches them in a manner of telling them all these wonderful things about our country. Now, I'm not against our country, you know, but I'm just saying, and it could possibly help. Now, I know that with them going through trauma and everything, that and medically and all of that has to be taken care of, that they're stable, but I think it's so important that the people that are, you know, the victims also are the ones that are the educators. So I just wanted to know if the task force, you know, was working on that and working with.
Absolutely, and that's a great point to make too, because that's a lot of how I learned. You know, I do give a lot of credit to a lot of the other folks that I've worked with, but just sitting down with the actual victim and talking about that particular trend that they went through, I always try to talk and get the genesis of how it all started. You know, even I know the trafficking law, you know, it's what happened here in the United States, but I go beyond that. I want to start from where they started and how things progressed as they came to the United States, and that's great, because I take a lot of that information with my outreach, for example. You know, of course, I don't give out the exact details of the report and stuff, but I do throw that information out as well. And then I also share that with the task force, with the law enforcement. And more often than not, it usually comes out as a surprise. Like, oh, wow, I didn't know that was happening, or I didn't know that traffickers were doing that. So to answer your question, yes, and I will never, ever stop listening and learning. I know it will always continue with talking with the victims. So yes, thank you very much.
You know, what you propose is actually a very good idea, in that in advancing it even further and actually having, you know, these individuals educating the community, like enlisting members to actually go out and speak with their peers. And the model that I look to is, again, legal services, because this is the beginning and a big chunk of my legal career, where eventually when we started going to labor camps and figured out that people don't speak Spanish, and they're, you know, they speak an indigenous language, and we are not making any progress because we're not being understood at all. There was a huge fundamental shift in the legal services farm workers programs to hiring what they called promotores, and they'll do it in health communities, health service communities as well. Promotores de salud, health promoters, legal promoters, basically training indigenous, you know, workers, hiring workers, paying workers to become part of your program and part of your outreach. And so that was a shift in legal services, where we started to hire indigenous workers. An example being Santiago Ventura, who was somebody who had many years ago been accused of murder in a labor camp, and he could not even speak to his defense because he did not even speak Spanish and was not given an interpreter. And our Supreme Court Justice de Muniz represented him, got him out of custody. He is now one of the top outreach workers for legal services, and he is completely tied to the indigenous community. We were able to litigate cases with labor camps of over 300 people, because now that he was there, people understood and trusted who we were. And we weren't going to make that progress until we had somebody who could speak uniquely to those issues. So that is a very, very good idea.
Just as a survivor services program, the point that I would like to add to that as well is just that it takes a lot of time with the survivors that we've worked with, and it takes an extremely brave survivor to get to that point oftentimes. So there are victims who I worked with 4 years ago who have come into my office and come and said, you know, now I think I'm willing to start speaking to this issue. But it's something that we have to be very patient with, and it's something that really needs to come from the survivor first, to say, yes, you know, I know this is happening to other people. I'm fed up. I want to talk about it. And we love it when that happens. And I've read every report that, and every declaration that's come into our office in the last 4 years from immigrant survivors in different types of trafficking, and if every single one of those stories could be made public, I would be so happy because people would really understand what these folks are going through. But survivors, it takes time. But you are right; they are the best educators.
Well, I just appreciate the fact that that component is there, though. And I understand it takes the person to want to come and do it, but I just appreciate the fact that it's there.
Absolutely.
And that you acknowledge that it's so important. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have one person who has signed up for public testimony, Jerry Williams.
You want me up there?
Yes, please.
Okay,
So welcome, Jerry.
thank you. I have a couple primers for you guys, for the commission to share. I do have it online, and then I have enough recommendations for all of you. That was a really good segue, because I'm a survivor of human trafficking and domestic survivor. And this is my friend Shelley. And Shelley is also a survivor of human trafficking here in Portland, Oregon. And we belong to an organization called Survivor to Survivor. One of the most important things, and the reason that we know that you want to talk about immigration today, but we had some very pressing needs that we needed to talk about now before the budget for the city. And so some of the recommendations we have currently, we drafted for the Human Rights Commission specifically, and one that we forgot. The most important thing is, like she said, we don't want 1 million task forces. It would be nice to have one task force where we can work together. Secondly, you need to have survivors on that task force. Third, you need to operate out of a victim-informed method in your work, and because victims who have lived through the experiences are invaluable to your process. They're almost impossible to do without victim-informed process. With little support in Portland for victims and survivors, it's crucial to meet them where they are. Not only physically, but psychologically, through pairing them with counselors trained in the areas of trauma survivorship. Re-exploitation of victims and survivors occur when asking them to volunteer and speak without financial compensation. Now, if you're not paying anybody, that's one thing. But if you're paying the movie star and you're not paying the survivor, that's not a good thing. Your strengths can add to an already existing model that already exists, the Human Trafficking Task Force. If we could have one collaborative one with survivor-informed people on it, that would be great. This will ensure your energy is being used effectively and efficiently for the city. Now, these are the things that we want to talk about right now, and specifically with immigration, because many, many years ago I worked with Stephen Manning when I was at the Workers' Organizing Committee, and we helped form the Jornalero Project. VOS needs to be funded by the city of Portland. VOS used to be funded a lot. Slowly, they pecked away, and Randy Leonard's office last year only gave them $25,000. This is a day labor project that provides some of that grassroots support for these people who are here looking for work, day laborers. And we have a day labor center, which PDC actually owns the land. We need to come up with some sort of solution. Centro de la Raza in Seattle was an old school up on a hill. Folks took it over, they took it over, and then the city of Seattle chose to rent it to them for $1 a year for 20 years, and now they own it. We can do something similar here. We want full funding for the New Options for Women program, which is currently the only funding for adult women to escape to life. We have small programs for youth, the commercially sexually exploited children, which we work with Multnomah County, but this is the only program for adult women to escape. What we've been told, that funding is coming out of the police force. What was really disturbing was that the police force is going to get $1.25 million for a training center, and yet cut the small little $250,000 it takes to run a program
to get women to escape out of the life. And the last recommendation we currently have for you is consider legislation to expand prostitution records, to allow mothers who have escaped the life to volunteer in their children's schools. That's all we have to say today. Thank you very much. Some of the budgetary items are very timely.
Thank you, Jerry. So who has questions that we weren't able to get to? I'm sure the panelists all have a sunburn from these lights now, but if we could just get to a few more, that would be great. Yes?
Mr. Bickford, as we heard today, and as I think a lot of people know, that one of the major obstacles to kind of more effectively addressing this issue is what you described as fear in these populations of coming, fear of coming forward. And the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office collaborates very closely with ICE in referring people who are processed through the Sheriff's Office for immigration proceedings and then deportation. I'm wondering if you've been able to advocate for policy changes around that information sharing, if you see potential for changes in Multnomah County Sheriff's Office policy around sharing that information and honoring for ICE.
Yeah, and I've been educating myself a great deal with that, the secure communities, things like that. And unfortunately, I'm just a lowly deputy, but I do plan to get more involved with that. My sheriff was here for a little while today. We talked a little bit about that. Our plan is to meet with the Enforcement Removal Operations Director and start working out protocol and trying to figure out a way to serve the community. I mean, that's, of course, the most important part of the Sheriff's Office. And I don't have a lot of great answers for you right now because, like I said, I'm not at that level. But it sounds like I'm going to get plugged into it very quickly because I was kind of ordered to start educating myself about all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I can tell you right now the talks are going to start, and I hope that the discussion and everything that comes out of that will be public knowledge. That we'll be able to discuss it with everybody, so we can keep everybody updated, and also bring in folks with ideas and I think it'd be important to hear from everyone. I don't personally have all the answers, and I know my sheriff doesn't either. So I'm hoping that's going to be the case. Absolutely.
Alan?
A lot of you up there have talked about outreach and getting the word out and using strategy. Where would you start with that strategy, and what would that message be? Would it be aimed at communities of victims? Would it be aimed at providers? Would it be aimed at government policy? Where would you start with your message?
I'd say the answer to that really is all of the above. Keith and I will speak to anyone about this issue, any group, any organization. We've talked to rooms of 2 people. We've talked to rooms of hundreds of people. We've gone out and spoken at immigrant service organizations. We've spoken at churches. We've spoken and provided actual training to domestic violence agencies. And then we go to schools. We go to civic organizations. The number of Rotary clubs where I've given a presentation on human trafficking, I couldn't even count. But that is fundamentally what it comes down to, is that you need to talk to everybody about this issue. That's how word gets out.
Miss?
I'm just agreeing with some of the points that you had to make about it being sort of a slippery slope of going from taking advantage of people to full out, trafficking and the exploitation scale, sort of slide down the slope there. I had a friend whose partner was a day laborer, and I didn't realize it, but apparently the industry norm is that half of his minimum wage went to the brokerage through which he had to get his jobs, because he couldn't just go and, get them some other way, and he was legal and all that good stuff, but as far as I'm concerned, he was still extremely exploited. And I'm just wondering, I'm not hearing in any of this, how complicit are like for the farm laborers, which is a big chunk of the trafficking, I think, how complicit are the owners of those properties? I mean, are they aware of who these people are who are actually doing the work? Do they care? Are they part of the outreach strategy, or are they part of the problem?
The folks that I have talked to, they are part of the outreach strategy, absolutely. But I've noticed that there's a communication barrier. There's your top level owners of the business or whatever that have no clue what's going on in their fields, no idea at all. That information stops at whatever field supervisor is kind of working out there, and the field supervisor for many cases I've noticed has been the problem.
Is it voluntary, they're not aware of the problem because they don't want to be aware of the problem because then they don't have to, or they're getting paid?
It could be any of that. I think a lot of it is from the folks I've talked to, is just that, well, that's so and so's area. So I think there could be some avoidance and maybe not wanting to know. There could be a lot of reasons. But as we get further and further into this, and I start to evolve a little bit, it used to be kind of a nice outreach in some cases. Now it's going to be a little bit more forceful, where it is your responsibility. This is your land. This is your business. You need to know what's going on. And Chris and I have called a couple of businesses out on that, contracts for cleaning, for example, or things like that. It's like, yeah, these are the people you're in charge of, and you need to be responsible for that. So I think being a little more pushing, a little bit more, with the education, of course, not just barreling right in. But it is part of the outreach, absolutely. To answer your question, yes. Unfortunately, we need more people to help with that. And
can't get everywhere.
Yeah, and that is that was mentioned over here too. That we need to expand this and develop whether it's victims talking or people who are more familiar with trafficking trends or more familiar with the world of trafficking to come out and talk and help with us, with the outreach as well.
I would just add to that point, and I think farm work is a prime example, but you're going to see that in other industries as well. In franchise, janitorial, construction is the next farm work. It's a lot of workers come here and settle, and that used to be a more lucrative endeavor to move into construction, but with our economy collapse, that became even worse than farm work. But and I'm not lambasting growers, but this is my recollection of doing that work, which was many growers will have an intermediary as an effort to buffer themselves, a farm labor contractor who's hired with the role of supervising, recruiting, bringing workers over. And it may be a conscious objective of that employer to remove themselves from the process to avoid liability, but frankly, under wage and hour law, as USCUL is here to say, there is joint liability. So, a big role of farm labor contractors is to go to the town where they know that there is a group of workers, send somebody down there, tell them that there's going to be work here, just come up, your work will be guaranteed. And you can imagine what happens along that process when people get there and there was no agreement about wages or living conditions, or the fact that their housing and meals would be deducted from their wages, and that at the end of the day they'd have no money, and they may even owe the contractor for having brought them over, so that is ripe for abuse. And yes, farm labor contractors should be on the hook, and intermediaries should be on the hook as well.
I think we have time for one more question in the back. You've been very patient.
I wanted to touch a little bit on what Jerry Williams was talking about in regards to when on the sexual exploitation piece, where victims black victims are usually starting at a very young age, and there's a lot of services and a lot of agencies that are collaborating, like CSAC, SARC, and places like that. I work on the adult services for him, none. And so I wanted to know what can be done, what is on the table to help these people.
Chris?
Sorry, Chris.
No, in seriousness, you've identified a gap that needs to be addressed, that, you know, the resources are slim all across the spectrum, and that for adult populations, they're, you know, we're struggling right now to curry the resources to even meet that need. So that is something, a good point and well taken, and something we need to keep on our radar.
I do know that Multnomah County, the Adult Division, Department of Human Justice has developed a committee to target some pieces that is mainly on the minor side, the children's side. I happen to be one person in the pre-adjudication piece, the Adult Division, that just is now learning about human trafficking and can start identifying cases as they come in. But that's, you're talking over 500 cases. And I only have 20. But we're trying to help educate everybody and help train them as these cases come in and as they get arrested and come into recall. I try to help identify them and then bring them to people's attention. But that's just one person out of all these people coming in, and it just needs to be addressed a little bit stronger, I think.
I think it's 8:30 now, and I think that's a really appropriate place to conclude this evening. The recognition that there are so many gaps. There is so much work to be done, and that this is really just the first step in the effort by the Human Rights Commission to try to jump into this and do what we can. So I know that Hector has a point of order.
It just was told to me that we're not the Human Rights Commission of the state of Oregon.
Right.
We are the Human Rights Commission of Portland. So at some point, it would be helpful for us to see what interface there is with the city of Portland. I know you'll have that information. You don't have to give it to us now. But I think that is important for us to know.
Thank you. So with that, thank you so much to our panelists for being here. And thank you to all of you for attending. Even though it's been 3 hours and it's hot, there's a lot of energy in here, so let's keep it going. So, thank you very much. Have a great night.